I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow, yet with an unwavering commitment to the absolute truth that the institution of the British monarchy has spent generations trying to shield from public view. Catherine did not raise her voice when she stood before a single palace camera inside the quiet confines of Windsor Castle, because she knew that the gravity of her message required no theatrical embellishment. The princess delivered the startling sentence that the royal household had desperately tried to avoid for months, revealing to household officials and the wider world that King Charles could no longer face the full, relentless weight of his royal duties. But it was not the public pressure of statecraft, nor the looming specter of advancing illness or familial rebellion, that left Prince William utterly motionless and Queen Camilla staring in disbelief at a closed door. It was a much deeper, more terrifying private reason that fundamentally altered the dynamics of the House of Windsor forever. Before the weight of this revelation settles completely over the future of the crown, it becomes vital to understand the sheer magnitude of what the sovereign's daily life actually entails. Constitutional meetings with the Prime Minister, confidential government papers delivered in secure red dispatch boxes, diplomatic audiences with foreign ambassadors, state ceremonies, and public engagements performed entirely in the sovereign's name form a crushing burden that demands absolute, unwavering mental clarity. Charles did not simply fear looking weak in front of a critical press or a watching nation. He feared misunderstanding a critical constitutional document or missing a vital administrative detail at a time when the crown required absolute certainty. Catherine continued through her recorded statement with a heavy heart, revealing that the king had privately asked to withdraw from numerous high-level duties because mounting exhaustion and sudden, terrifying moments of cognitive confusion had left him deeply afraid of making a catastrophic mistake that could destabilize the entire realm. The confession grew increasingly painful as the princess described a deeply intimate conversation in which the monarch had gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white, admitting that every single public appearance had become an exhausting, agonizing performance of confidence. He no longer entered crowded rooms thinking about the noble purpose of service. Instead, he entered them dreading the precise instant his failing concentration might give out completely. Duty, which had once been the guiding purpose of his entire life, had transformed into something he secretly feared. William watched the playback without a single interruption, lowering his eyes as his wife repeated those harrowing words, slowly removing his signet ring in a silent, reflective gesture that exposed the heavy thought he could not yet voice aloud. He knew with sudden, crushing clarity that the full weight of royal responsibility might be moving toward his shoulders far sooner than any devoted son would ever want to bear. Catherine noticed the profound shift in the room, hesitated for a brief second, and then made the courageous decision to continue, knowing full well that stopping now would only turn Charles's silent suffering back into another dark palace secret. Then came the chilling detail that changed everything during a private briefing at the residence. The king had opened a locked red dispatch box, the secure container used daily to deliver important government papers to the sovereign, and had completely failed to recognize a major state decision he himself had personally approved just the previous evening. For several agonizing seconds, Charles had stared at the official state page as though it had been written by a total stranger in a foreign language. Catherine admitted through her recording that she had initially promised the king never to expose that heartbreaking moment of vulnerability, but she ultimately broke her word after discovering that another demanding, high-profile ceremony had been deceitfully restored to his official calendar despite his desperate plea for relief. Her confession was no longer merely a revelation. It was a desperate act of protection designed to save the king from his own relentless dedication. When the recorded statement finally concluded, Queen Camilla received a handwritten transcript of the briefing in her private quarters. She read a single paragraph twice, placed the pages face down on the polished wooden table with deliberate slowness, and asked the chilling question that hung heavy in the air. Who gave Catherine the absolute authority to say this to the world? Before the royal family could even begin to confront that explosive answer, they first had to confront the fractured lives her words had instantly altered. Behind the glittering titles and ancient traditions were three distinct people trapped by one unbearable, inescapable truth. Charles lived in constant fear of becoming a heavy, helpless burden to the crown he had waited decades to inherit. William lived in dread of appearing overly eager to replace his ailing father, and Catherine, caught directly between them, carried the overwhelming guilt of exposing a deep confidence that had been offered in absolute desperation. Yet, standing outside that fragile, tense circle was a queen who was utterly unprepared to surrender control over the final, defining chapter of her husband's reign, setting the stage for an unprecedented institutional and familial battle. The confrontation inside the Windsor drawing room lasted less than 12 tense minutes. Yet every single spoken sentence carried years of buried tension, unspoken grievances, and fierce protection. Queen Camilla had reached the private room first, deliberately dismissing every palace aide and refusing an official minute, the written record normally created to preserve what is said during crucial royal meetings. Before Catherine even arrived, the Queen had purposefully moved Charles's usual armchair away from the main table, making her intentions unmistakably clear. This high-stakes conversation concerned her husband, but his own voice would not be present to defend either woman. Catherine entered without carrying files or folders, offering no traditional or ceremonial greeting to the Queen. The princess immediately explained that she had recorded her public statement only after household planners restored 3 immensely demanding events that the king had personally asked to postpone due to his overwhelming fatigue. She had watched the cold, unyielding machinery of royal routine overrule his fear once before, and she swore she would not allow schedules, ancient traditions, and superficial appearances to force him back into the public eye before he could genuinely trust his own mind. Camilla leaned forward across the mahogany surface, her voice sharp with suppressed fury. "You made his worst moment belong to everyone," she accused, condemning the princess for tearing down the protective walls the palace had worked so hard to build. Catherine's voice tightened defensively as she answered that Charles's true worst moment had actually begun when those closest to him treated basic human honesty as an existential threat to his reign. The future queen's voice nearly broke under the emotional strain, but she refused to withdraw a single word of her accusation. The argument quickly turned cruel and deeply personal as Camilla claimed that William's wife was merely clearing a calculated path for the direct heir to seize the throne. Hearing this unfair assault, Catherine pushed her chair back and stood up tall, revealing that the prince had actually spent the previous night desperately urging senior officials not to prepare an accession timetable. The formal, secret plan used only when a new monarch must take the throne immediately. He was not seeking power or rushing his father's exit. He was trying to stop his father's private suffering from becoming someone else's political opportunity. To silence any remaining doubt, Catherine unlocked her phone and played a recorded conversation where King Charles himself clearly requested that his principal engagements be suspended until he could fully trust his own concentration again. That direct audio recording stood in stark, undeniable contradiction to the later written instruction that had ordered his program to continue unchanged. For several long seconds, the Queen said nothing at all, staring at the screen before finally admitting a stunning truth. She confessed that she had actively encouraged the second instruction because she genuinely believed that a complete withdrawal from public life would destroy her husband emotionally much faster than physical exhaustion ever could. A reduced schedule, she argued passionately, would inevitably become permanent, and the broken king would soon be forced to watch the crown move forward into a new era without him, completely sidelined by his own family. Catherine turned and reached for the door handle to leave, but Camilla stopped her with one final, chilling revelation that changed the entire landscape of the crisis. Senior constitutional advisors had already been summoned, officials whose sole legal responsibility was to protect the lawful operation of the monarchy, meaning family loyalty would no longer be allowed to decide Charles's future. The wound had now been entirely exposed to the cold mechanisms of the state, and the next judgment would come from a ruthless world ruled by legal signatures, ancient precedents, and absolute power. Palaces have always survived raw emotion by turning it into cold procedure. A frightened personal confession is quickly transformed into a formal memorandum. A passionate family argument becomes a constitutional council meeting, and a king's momentary hesitation instantly turns into a grave question of royal authority. Yet, when Prince William later entered the Grand Council chamber and saw his father's traditional place left completely empty at the head of the table, The machinery of the monarchy no longer felt reassuring or majestic. It felt profoundly merciless, and every single official document resting on the table seemed to push Charles one agonizing step further away from the throne he had waited a lifetime to occupy. William stopped just outside the heavy oak doors, closed his eyes, and rehearsed 6 vital words beneath his breath. "My father remains the king." Inside the chamber, senior advisors were already actively considering the deployment of counselors of state, the specific royals legally permitted to perform selected official functions when the reigning monarch is temporarily unavailable. This constitutional safeguard would not legally end Charles's reign, but it would allow essential state work to continue smoothly while shielding him from duties he no longer felt mentally equipped to face. Control over the future of the crown remained heavily divided among competing factions. Charles alone held the supreme sovereign authority to officially approve a temporary reduction in his workload. Government officials could advise on constitutional continuity, and William could step up to accept additional grueling work, but the heir could not simply seize power by force. Camilla still possessed immense behind-the-scenes influence through her constant, intimate access to her husband, while Catherine held the devastating recorded proof demonstrating precisely what the king had requested before outside pressure entered the room. When William finally opened the formal meeting, he spoke the exact sentence he had practiced, declaring with unwavering firmness that he would fully support a practical, compassionate solution, but he would never permit anyone within the palace walls to treat his father as if he had already disappeared from this world. His strict royal restraint barely concealed a simmering, protective anger, making it clear to everyone present that while protecting the crown was an absolute necessity, emotionally erasing Charles to make that protection easier was a line no one would be allowed to cross. When the proposed, scaled-back schedule finally reached the king in his private apartment, he read through every single page in absolute silence, slowly removed his reading glasses, and placed them gently beside the paper without uttering a word. The deepest wound inflicted upon him was not the loss of high-profile ceremonies or grand state banquets. It was seeing his lifelong responsibilities ruthlessly divided into neat, clinical columns printed beside the names of his son, Catherine, and other family members. The monarchy had successfully converted his deepest personal fear into an organized, bureaucratic plan. Advisors officially authenticated Catherine's recording and meticulously compared it with the conflicting written instructions, establishing beyond a doubt that Charles's spoken request for relief had come first, while the later order maintaining his punishing schedule had followed an exhausting evening and carried an uneven initial that looked visibly different from his usual sovereign mark. Camilla received this official judgment in tense silence. While the palace officials made no formal accusation of personal misconduct against her, they firmly ruled that informal encouragement could never replace an unpressured royal decision made by the sovereign himself, formally limiting the queen's attempt to preserve her husband's reign at all costs for the very first time in history. The final confrontation between the royal family and the relentless machinery of the state began in the quiet solitude of the garden room, far away from the formal council chambers and official state documents. Charles had specifically chosen this serene location because it carried no heavy historical connection to councils or constitutional business, providing an intimate space where a father could finally surrender part of his dream without completely surrendering his own dignity. There were no military uniforms, leather-bound folders, or official witnesses present when the king sat beside his son, no longer acting as a sovereign desperately defending absolute authority, but as a weary man trying to find peace. For several long moments, neither man spoke a single word. Then, Charles placed the thick royal diary between them, the official schedule recording every engagement and responsibility of the monarch, and asked William to cross out every single event he firmly believed his father should no longer attempt to shoulder. The heartbreaking request wounded them both deeply, yet it finally made raw, unfiltered honesty possible between the future of the crown and the man who had carried it through decades of uncertainty. William had arrived at the garden room expecting stiff resistance or sudden anger, but instead found his father holding the very calendar that had become the suffocating symbol of everything crushing him. The king spoke first, clarifying with profound relief that he had no intention of abdicating, an extreme act that would mean formally giving up the throne and bringing an immediate, abrupt end to his reign. Instead, He wanted a smaller, more sustainable pattern of service built entirely around constitutional duties he could perform with absolute clarity and mental precision. He would remain the sovereign, but he would finally stop pretending that royal loyalty required unlimited, destructive physical strength. Charles then confessed that he had initially resented Catherine for revealing the harsh truth, admitting that her recorded statement had forced him to confront just how frightened and vulnerable he had truly become behind closed doors. Yet, the monarch also deeply understood that her bold action had ultimately prevented his private fear from being permanently buried beneath endless ceremonies and institutional silence. William answered softly that his wife had acted because both father and son had been far too afraid of hurting each other's feelings to speak the unvarnished truth aloud. When Charles asked if his son was truly ready for what came next, the prince refused to offer the heroic, hollow answer expected of a royal heir. He was fully prepared to help shoulder the burden, he said, but he was not prepared to sacrifice the genuine relationship hidden beneath their formal titles. His father placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder, and the future king finally allowed himself to shed the tears he had held back for months. With his father's explicit permission, William opened a sacred diary and drew a definitive line through the grueling diplomatic tour, the extended investiture ceremonies, and the late evening state receptions that had drained the king's vitality. In place of those overwhelming duties, the king retained a weekly private government audience, one vital charitable engagement, and essential constitutional approval supported by shorter, streamlined briefings. Every single line crossed out carried profound grief, but every duty carefully preserved gave that lingering grief a true, honorable purpose. Charles then asked Catherine to join them in the garden room, and when she arrived, he admitted with quiet grace that breaking his confidence had caused immense personal pain, but it had also successfully ended a much more dangerous deception that could have destroyed them all. While family unity was painstakingly being pieced back together behind closed doors, her original words had already swept across the globe, and outside the gates of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, a grieving and sympathetic world was gathering around one unforgettable image. By morning, the monarchy's deepest private reckoning belonged entirely to the public domain, as major television broadcasters endlessly repeated Catherine's statement and commentators fiercely argued over duty, personal dignity, and whether the public had been told far too much. Yet, one poignant moment outside the palace gates cut straight through the deafening noise of the media. An elderly war veteran slowly approached the heavy iron gates, removed his worn hat, and placed a simple handwritten card among the sea of floral tributes. Its message was concise, consisting of only 7 powerful words that instantly defined the national mood. A king is still human. Let him rest. Within hours, those 7 words became the rallying cry of the nation, prompting the palace to officially confirm that Charles would remain sovereign while temporarily reducing his program, while William and Catherine stepped forward to assume additional public and constitutional responsibilities to keep the state functioning smoothly. Media coverage divided sharply across the nation, with some conservative commentators accusing Catherine of exposing a sacred confidence that belonged to Charles alone, while others argued that her courageous statement finally revealed the impossible, inhuman expectations placed upon an aging king. One prominent national broadcaster accurately described the new arrangement not as an abdication, but as a historic renegotiation of royal duty, proving that the reign could successfully continue in a reduced, compassionate form without collapsing under the weight of tradition. When the final sealed decision officially reached the king, his expression changed instantly. The palace had successfully found its administrative solution, but no bureaucratic procedure could ever soften the stark moment he realized how efficiently royal life could continue without his constant presence. The first tangible consequence appeared on a simple cream-colored card where Charles's name was permanently removed from a major diplomatic audience and replaced with William's. There were no trumpets, no grand announcements, and no public farewells. Only fresh black ink where the king's presence had once been blindly assumed. When Charles saw it, he did not rage. He simply folded the card once, placed it inside a quiet wooden drawer, and whispered that the palace had learned to continue without him remarkably quickly. The rewritten calendar immediately made everything starkly real as officials officially canceled 2 major audiences, an investiture, and a regional visit, replacing them with streamlined procedures designed to protect the monarch's fragile state of mind. Palace staff received strict, careful instructions to shield Charles from unnecessary pressure while meticulously preserving his constitutional right to choose, turning every single new day into a quiet examination where the implicit question always hung in the air. Are you capable today? Charles tried his absolute best to reassure William, noting that watching his son perform state duties should make any father immensely proud, yet an unavoidable strain of bitterness lingered in every word he spoke. The king did not resent his son. Rather, he deeply resented the passage of time, his own physical weakness, and the crown's ruthless ability to replace whoever could no longer carry its crushing weight. Later that evening, Catherine found her recorded statement playing silently on a tablet in Charles's study, and when she looked at him, he asked whether she finally understood that he had desperately wanted genuine help, not public exposure. She answered softly that she had feared palace officials would push him until he collapsed entirely before the public eye, proving their mutual dedication to protecting his well-being above all else. The final chapter of this profound crisis required one last, courageous act from the man whose silence had started it all. Charles returned to the very same wooden desk where confusion and fear had first frightened him into silence months ago. But this time, there was no crowded calendar beside him and no family member forced to carry his words to the world. Looking directly into the camera lens with absolute calm and unwavering clarity, the king acknowledged the undeniable truth. He had continued far beyond his mental limits because he foolishly believed that blind endurance was the only acceptable price of wearing the crown. Then, he delivered the verdict that finally brought the crisis to a peaceful close, declaring that service without honesty was no longer service at all, but a hollow performance. The monarchy had successfully adapted without declaring a winner or creating another tragic casualty, choosing humanity over relentless performance. No dark secrets remained hidden within the palace walls. The family had embraced the raw truth together, and the British monarchy moved forward into a new era. Wounded, deeply changed, and finally, unreservedly honest.